Hello, it is I, S.B.R.E. Brown. Take a seat and tell me what appears to be the problem. Okay, I have another 4 questions about pens, and we're going to start with the first question. You know this by now, I think, but in case you haven't seen any, I tend to abbreviate the questions a little bit. But in a nutshell, are certain converters better than other converters? For example, converters with a wider mouth versus converters with a narrower mouth. That's a very interesting question, and I really try to think, because I have used a number of converters, of course, many standard international converters which have a fairly narrow mouth, nipple, whatever you like to call it. But then there are indeed converters that have a much wider mouth. Think of some of the Japanese type converters. Sailor is somewhat wider. I find Platinum to be a little wider. So is Pilot, right? It's been a while that I used. Yeah, no, so is Pilot. Yeah. Is one better than the other? I don't know. I will say that I feel that I have had fewer issues with the wider mouth converters when it comes to flow than I've had with some narrow mouth converters. But of course, a lot of factors come into play. The ink you use, but also your climate, where you live, that affects ink flow. And I appreciate the idea of a wider mouth, better ink flow. I don't think it's always the case. I think there's typically a bit of surface tension in your converter anyway. It's also the inside of the walls of the converter that can be covered with oil residue or stuff from the production of those converters. What I will say is I have found the wide mouth converters so much easier to clean. I typically draw up water and expel it, but the wide mouth converters I have found much easier to clean, even with a syringe. I mean, an actual syringe with a blunt needle. I found that a lot easier than a narrow mouth converter, simply because some of the narrow mouth converters, when you stick in the needle from the syringe, that blocks the entire aperture, and as a result no water really easily flushes out. So from that perspective, I find the wide mouth converters nicer to use because they're easier to clean. Whether they truly function better, well, that's going to require an experiment that I think at some point we should run. I just haven't done it yet. But it's an interesting question, so I hope that insight helps a bit. Okay, the next question. I have a Stipula Etruria and the nib looks corroded. I write with it, I put the cap down, there is ink on the grip section on the cap threads. Well, that sounds like 2 separate things. Nibs corroding, that's possible, but that's very unlikely if the nib is gold. And I've never seen a titanium nib corrode either. What I have seen happen is ink, brown ink, and crust on the nib a bit. And I've had that a few times, and I was convinced one of my nibs had rusted, but it was just ink. So give that a good flushing, maybe in an ultrasonic cleaner, and then see what happens. As to the other issue with ink on the grip section on the cap threads, well, that could be a number of things. The Etrurias, no, let me rephrase that. One of the Etrurias I have, the only Etruria I have, is the large Magnifica. So the Etruria Magnifica, sorry, that is the large one. The Etruria Magnifica Alter Ego, that's the celluloid. And it has a captive converter. And I can very carefully unscrew the nib unit and the whole thing comes out. But there is a tiny rubber O-ring near not at the end of the nib unit, but at the top actually, where the nib and feed enter the nib collar. If for some reason, for example, you've disassembled your pen and you have lost that little rubber O-ring, then I could see how potentially there might be a bit more leakage. So I would check that. Might be too late now, but you might be able to replace it with something else. Bear in mind that ink on the inside of the cap or on the cap threads is not uncommon. It depends a bit on how you carry your pens and how you cap the pens. If you have a pen like this Pilot Metropolitan, which happens to have a snap cap, every time you do this, you could aerosolize a bit of ink that splatters the inside of the cap. When that happens, that ink's going to go somewhere, and it may just end up on your section or on your threads, right? If you have a threaded, this is a rollerball, but if you have a fountain pen with a screw-on cap and you are a bit vigorous, I'm exaggerating here, I don't think a lot of people would cap their fountain pens like this, but if you are a little vigorous, or if you even sort of sit with it, flicking it a bit around, like this, because you are bored and you're doing things, obviously ink may end up on the section. So often I found that when my pens have ink on the section, it's user error, and it is me having done something. And that can even be something like having a pen in a bag that swings around or something like that. So all of these things I would consider before concluding that the pen is truly broken. Now, if you have a converter in it and that converter or cartridge drains itself entirely, right? It's just whenever you uncap it, all the ink has flown out into the cap. First of all, don't carry it nipped down. But secondly, well, then I think you can safely say there's probably a defect somewhere. And that could be as simple as the nipple on the converter just having developed a crack, and then you just replace the converter, and then you're done. This, I thought, was an interesting question too. Do you think there is anything consumers can do to have pen companies, improve their quality control? And do you think there are improvements to be made, or has quality control plateaued? That is a very broad question. When it comes to the final part first, when it comes to quality control having plateaued, yes, I think there are certain companies that simply cannot do better than they are doing, and I mean that for better or for worse. Some companies, I think, deliver excellent work every single time, and other companies don't. This is frustrating because you end up forking out your hard-earned cash on a pen, and then the performance of the pen may be lacking. Is that how it should be? No, it is not. I don't know what it is about pens, though. If you would have a company that produces cars and every third car breaks down as soon as you drive away from the dealership, nobody would accept that. If you were to have mobile phones, aka cell phones, that explode, like every third cell phone or fourth cell phone or every second cell phone explodes, that would be a problem. People would not accept that. Even if it would be a matter of the battery discharges within an hour after, as soon as you've purchased it, nobody would accept that. But when it comes to fountain pens, people are like, nah, it's okay. It's okay. Like, there's about a 50% chance this pen is not going to write, but that's okay. And I'm exaggerating again. Some companies do better than others. I think that's just a fact. Some companies also care about their customers more. I really do believe that. There are certain companies that make pens that never seem to have been designed to write with. And all that's fine. It's all fine. I'm just saying it's just my experience. The real question then is, can we do anything about it? I don't think so. Because everybody is accepting the problem as is. Everybody's accepting that you buy a $1,000 pen and you may have to send it to a nibmeister to get the nib tuned, or a $500 pen and you have to send it to a nibmeister to get the nib tuned. Fortunately, there now are, I think, you see a couple of initiatives, for example, with Appelboom, where you can have your nib tuned by a nib specialist before it is sent out. I don't think that should be necessary. One would hope that a pen would at least write normally. Now, write to your specifications, that's something else. Not a single pen company can churn out pens that are the right wetness for everyone, because some people like drier pens, some people like wetter pens. So that I don't think is a fair criticism. But what is a fair criticism is that a pen should write. If it doesn't write out of the box, and I've had this experience to me a number of times, then it is a problem. But given that we all accept it, I don't see that changing anytime soon. Could we sort of form a union of fountain pen users and start to protest outside the doors of big pen factories? Maybe, and maybe then something would change. I think the big difference is between the companies that make pens solely to make money. And if making rubber boots would make more money, they'd be making rubber boots. These companies don't really care about you as a user, they just want to make money. And if you compare that to other companies, often smaller companies, that do really want to deliver a great product and that really care about you as an end user, well, with those latter companies, you don't have a problem, because if something arises, in my experience, they're always willing to help you out, and you can send a pen back, they will tune a nib, they will do something for you. They seek to make it right. But a lot of the bigger companies, they don't care. And why would they? Send your pen back. The moment your pen is sent back, 15 other people have bought one of their pens. So it doesn't matter to them. And that's a sad state of affairs, but I do think it's a real thing. Am I cynical? Who knows? My final question is the most philosophical one. This is compressed a bit again, but why do some people like modern pens and others like vintage pens, kind of from my perspective as a psychologist? And this person also comments, I've actually found there to be quite a sharp divide online. So do I. And I'm going to make a few potentially sweeping generalizations here, but I do think the world is split in two when it comes to fountain pens. There are those people who like modern pens, there are those people who like vintage pens, and there are some people who like both, but a lot of people are either or. And that leads to specific situations. People who like modern pens can be made to feel very unwelcome at pen shows. People who are new to the pen world can be made to feel very uncomfortable and unwelcome at pen shows, because pen shows have developed as an expression of collector and collector's enjoyment, right? So that was a really weird sentence. There were people who collected pens, and now I'm talking vintage pens, period, who formed pen clubs, and pen clubs had meetings, and slowly pen meetings grew into pen shows. But almost invariably, those are the hardcore collectors are vintage collectors. And I have heard about people being treated very unpleasantly, new people at pen shows, newcomers at pen shows. There are great exceptions in pen vendors. I can't mention everyone, but a few people, Sarge Minhas, Cliff Harrington, Miro, aka, known as Miro, but Miroslav Tischler, a number of others, Tom Westerich. There are several people who are vintage collectors. Sarge, I think, is a bit of both, but I think these other people I've mentioned are all, it's safe to say they're all vintage collectors, but they treat everyone very nicely. There also are vendors at pen shows who do not, period. I'm sorry, but I've seen it happen, so that's just the way it is. And they don't care about people who like modern. They don't care about newcomers. They don't care about you if you just want to buy a Noodler's pen or something. They won't give you the time of day. Most vendors, of course, are somewhere in between. And I'm sorry to put things this bluntly, but again, I've seen this happen. So it's just the way it is at pen shows. Is there such a divide? Yeah, because I've just given you some examples of how that manifests. Now the question is, why does that happen? Well, why that divide happens is simple. That's an in-group, out-group effect. People want to be part of an in-group, and anyone who's not part of that group is the out-group, and we cast those people out. This is what we have been doing, evolutionarily speaking, for a very long time, and that's what we continue to do. And it doesn't matter whether it's vintage fountain pens or modern fountain pens, or stamp collectors versus non-stamp collectors, or collectors of British stamps versus collectors of German stamps, or French stamps, or Japanese stamps. There is an in-group within an in-group within an So that I sometimes find a complicated problem, because there doesn't necessarily seem to be a lot of interest of the two groups to talk. And to be honest, why would there be? What connects the two groups is the love of fountain pens. But someone who really loves early 1900 Watermans, I'm just making something up here, why would that person want to talk to someone who collects modern day Viscontis? Right? They're both fountain pens, yeah, this is true, but they're very, very different pens. And I can see how the one may not be able to really appreciate the other, just talking about the pens, right? I am one of these people. I like modern pens. I don't care about vintage pens. I would never be unpleasant to someone who only likes vintage pens, because again, in my mind, we all collect pens, but for some reason that seems to be a revolutionary thought when you go to a pen show, because again, that's not my experience. It's one versus the other. So you can have wonderful conversations also at pen shows, right, with people who are in a somewhat different niche of the fountain pen than you are. But unless that really happens and is encouraged, for some reason you get the vintage group and the modern group, and I don't think there's a lot of communication. And some people, again, are both, and that's fantastic. But I don't see that happen a whole lot. And again, I think it's an in-group, out-group effect, where that may also not really be that interest to do both and to interact, because it's considered very different worlds. And I'm sorry, but I will say this, I have more than once sort of gotten the impression at pen shows that if you are not a vintage collector, you're not a pen person. If you're not a vintage collector, you don't really like fountain pens. And sometimes that's a matter of, well, if you don't like fountain pens made between 1910 and 1925, you're not a real pen person. Because those were the best pens ever made. I'm not saying that, I'm just saying, it's just an example. Utterly unnecessary. But I think this is a bit of human nature. And to me, yeah, the vintage pens don't appeal to me, but that I've discussed it before, so I'll be brief. It's often their size, it's often their fragility, it's often the flex nibs. I don't care about any of these things. So for me, the vintage pens just don't work so well. I'm happy if they do for you, right? But that's not really my cup of tea. I feel that sounded maybe a little bit harsh or unpleasant. It's definitely not meant to sound unpleasant. It's definitely not meant to sound bitter or something. Because at the end of the day, I don't really care how people choose to treat me at a pen show, as long as I have a good time and nobody gets hurt. But that's pretty much it. So it is a strange divide. I agree, and I also experience it as such. But I think it's the way it is. And I think you'll see this in any kind of hobby or endeavor. Yeah. Anyway, I hope that was an answer to your question. If not, then ask the question again, but in different words. Hope this was useful, people. Thank you for watching. I will see you again next time with more Consult the Doctor.